All right, everybody. Andy Davis and Neil Batra here to talk to you about the dawn of a new health CEO. You'll see multiple installments of topics, and today's really interesting. What we're going to talk about is the improved role of health literacy for the consumer, which is pretty interesting. Again, sitting here at CES, we get to see everything around how we're trying to activate the consumer. And with that becomes a knowledge around what's happening within your body. How do you actually become more familiar with disease progression, prevention? And so Neil, I'll pass it to you. What do you think has changed, and why do we see an increased health literacy for the consumer?
I think what you're finding is an activation in general around society. There's a lot more information around our health and well-being. I think social media plays a role where you're seeing how folks live and you're getting insight in terms of maybe some of the choices you make. It's really interesting because the data doesn't necessarily say health literacy is moving at a significant rate or pace in terms of how it's historically measured. The level of activation and the confidence the consumer is demonstrating around choices that really matter for their health, they're much more confident in making those. They're much more insistent on making those, and they're expressing a perspective where historically they haven't. You would show up at the local facility, you would have a clinician that would sort of advise you on what to do, and you would do it, and that's that. Now, you're showing up and you probably have data. You probably have reference materials, in terms of doing online searches to get some context. You may even have some additional tests you've been able to do at home already. You probably have a network of people you can bounce off of who also have access to information. And you're showing up with an opinion and a perspective. And if you don't like what you're hearing from that clinician, you actually have the option of going on the online route and getting a second opinion, maybe going elsewhere within the facility if you have the confidence to ask for a second opinion in person in that facility. But there's just so much more energy around this notion that I own my health. I'm going to take the reins of my health to the extent I can. And that is a consumerism marketplace pressure that has really not been there except over the last handful of years in an increased way.
Well, I think about it too, and again, you can disagree with maybe the framing that I would use is it's not that they're the most educated person about health and every diagnosis, but they're interested in it for the first time in a long, and they have the data to actually go interrogate it, understand it, and actually investigate their own health, which they wouldn't have had 15, 20 years ago. And so instead of taking all the intel they have from a doctor and saying, okay, this is, I guess, what I have, to your point, they can go talk to individuals who've been found in the same situation. They can go search on the web. They can use a wearable. And now they're informed, maybe sometimes misinformed, but informed around something and creating an opinion.
Activated.
And that an opinion matters so much in someone actually making choice around behavior change, which I think is so critical. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. And I think why it matters, so I absolutely agree with that assessment. Why it matters is that historically, if you were a B2B business or you sold to consumers, but in general, consumer opinion didn't move much, you didn't really have to track the changing dynamics of consumer opinion. I think where we are now, and CES is demonstrating this, is over 20% of the floor is health in some way, right? Maybe excess of that. You got to really pay attention to this moving bogey now. How a consumer shows up in the world radically different now than it was 3 years ago, versus 5 years ago, versus 10 years ago. And that rate of change is not something that a lot of organizations have been accustomed to. And I don't think a lot of organizations have the mechanisms to track that on an annual or even multi times within a year to understand how that's changing and therefore how I have to present to the world. How do I market to these folks? How do I price for these folks? How do I assure them that I've got their best interests in mind, right? These are things that a more activated consumer is going to demand that historically a more docile consumer didn't really care much about. And if they did, they certainly didn't express it.
Yeah. And now I'll throw things at you we don't plan for. What's the role of an employer in actually helping engage in health literacy for every employee they have?
Yeah, the employer role in our view, and I know you share this perspective, but unbelievably influential and might be the wedge that sits in the middle of all of this. And I think they've been underappreciated. It is in their interest for their employees to be healthy. And it's not just absenteeism, but it's also stickiness and culture within your organization. It's your ability to retain elite talent. It's your ability to attract elite talent. If you go back to the origination of why health is linked to employment, it was viewed as an employee benefit. At that point, it was a sick care benefit. I think where we are moving now is that health is a much broader issue than sick care. You can call it wellness and well care and sick care. And I think employers have to morph to deliver that benefit to get the same outcomes they were seeking when they initially gave the benefit at all, which is I want to attract great talent. I want to keep it. I want them to be happy when they're here so they perform at their best.
Yeah, and I just want to reemphasize because the employer has so much to gain
Yes.
by actually helping a consumer become more health literate, produce solutions, vendors, data that allow them to make choice. Because if an employee is healthy and making choices around their mental and physical health and well-being, they're a more productive employee. And so the employer has everything to gain and has a lot of the agency to make those changes.
Yeah.
So,
and maybe last comment from me on this topic,
Yeah.
and I know you know this, but in the travels that you and I have as we're serving clients around the industry, we know there are very innovative benefits managers and human resource and human capital executives within our client base that are really eager to solve this problem. So if you're listening to this, over whatever medium you're listening to this is not a intellectual or hypothetical dynamic. We know there are going to be organizations that buy into this and are going to expand the way in which they address health for their employee. And frankly, if you are not thinking about that meaningfully as an organization, you are behind right now. And I think that's an important point because I don't know if that's being talked about enough in the general health media. And I think it's a point of emphasis.
yeah, it's awesome. So the dawn of a new health CEO, go out there. If you haven't looked at it already, go look at it. If you're an employer, like Neil just had the call to action, you have a role to activate the health literacy of your consumer, which is already engaging within their healthcare. So we'll see you at one of our next modules. And with that, again, dawn of a health CEO. See you next time.